Ricardo, for having me here. And trust me, I feel in very friendly company. And in fact, I would say I have the comparative advantage of being allowed to be very superficial, which is what I'm going to do now, give a big framework. And so that indeed, Gianmarco and Giorgio will go into much greater technicalities and details where I stay in my surface. And just to say, as an IR scholar, um, you cited military cooperation, or rather nuclear and migration, etc. So this is what I worry about. To what extent and how and under what condition countries cooperate or not. And one twist to this overall inquiry for most of my career has, most recently, I've been asking this question: can Europe be a laboratory for world or planetary politics? And I'd use planetary appellation because planetary, of course, speaks to the topic at hand today. And I use laboratory to convey the idea that we don't want to have a kind of colonial understanding of Europe as a model for the rest of the world. But laboratory has a different connotation. It means that you make more mistakes than, than successes, and that others can learn from your mistakes as well as your successes. So it's a very different story, but maybe we can kind of talk about this. And so in this context, then, I just want to give you three frames and then a kind of framework to think of the category of issues before my colleagues, esteemed colleagues, go into more detail. So I have a first frame that I use a lot. Ooh, the title is not visible coverage.
I think it's not.
Yeah. Pictures are chaotic, so you can, you can
Sorry.
can you guess the title? The title is, I think it's Deterministic Chaos Theory. Right? This is why I actually want to show the pictures. And so it's a bit, and Tim was very brilliant on this. You know, we live in a world where we both have hyperdeterminism, but chaos theory and the apparently random patterns, which are themselves governed by deterministic law. And it's all the more true in a global context, where we have, indeed, when we ask what Europe can do with and to the rest of the world, we have all these things going on, perception that whatever we say is a colonial trope and we just want to impose stuff to the rest of the world. The question of how do you appropriate common inheritance? How do you accept trade-offs in Europe and in the world? Our attitudes that will change on climate refugees. What about crisis dynamics and how we deal with crisis? And in Europe or the rest of the world, trust in governments and what they can do. Okay, so we have this first frame. The second frame that I like to use, oops.
For now?
Okay, cool. I'll use this one. The down. Okay, well, those are both. Is that the basic kind of power-based question that we're asking always is the gap between who adjusts, who will adjust, which is always the question in international relations, as it is domestically, as the world change, as context change, and who should adjust, which of course is not the same, who actually should adjust. And of course, this is determined by asymmetric power and asymmetric burdens. And so we have many and more criteria for who adjusts and who shouldn't. To me, probably the most important is that importing or exporting countries, is it about production or consumption of CO2? And it's come up several times today. And of course, this corresponds to individuals, groups, and countries. Historical current emitters, for rich, cui bono, the usual question. So that's the second frame. Again, I'm going fast because I want to reach my last bit, which is the most important. But the third frame relates to what Ricardo stated just earlier. When we speak about pan-European and global, we tend to always refer to the prisoner's dilemma, the traditional frame of tragedy of the common. My argument is that the EU has already moved beyond PD. And the question is, does it assume that the rest of the world can do so too and should do so too? So PD requires advanced solutions like monitoring compliance, sanctioning defection, facilitate reciprocity and assigning property rights under the context of domestic distributional conflict. But what we are under in the EU context is a paradigm shift where I think it's a misdiagnosis in international relations theory and IPE, where we overemphasize free riding as the chief barriers to international cooperation. And instead, we need to argue and act as if it was true that international institutions can promote cooperation not by solving the problem of free riding and credible commitments, or at least not only, but by mobilizing incremental action that can shift the strategy and preferences of states and other actors over time. And that's quite, we heard this from Alessio and others. I mean, this is a very broad statement, compatible with many of the arguments that were made over the last 2 days, but I'm just simplifying here. So the question we ask here is, in this context, what is the consistency between the internal and the external EU action? And if we want to beyond managing free riding, I refer to this as catalytic cooperation. Tom Hale and some of the discussion we had at Oxford University over several years, we're kind of fleshing out this alternative understanding of international cooperation, which is a much more optimistic idea that cooperative action can become progressively self-reinforcing over time. If early movers reach a critical mass, because you have joint product, you have these private benefit, co-benefits, and competitive advantage, which accelerate, adoption of policy change and behavioral change. You have preference heterogeneity even before you have preference and change vis-a-vis mitigation, and you have increasing return, action-based increasing return, where passed on the basis that the acting now lowers the cost and raises the benefit of action in the future. Okay, again, all of this has been around in this, my students need to hear this. I mean, you don't need to hear this, although interestingly, we still refer to the tragedy of the common and the PD. And so there's a bit of a discrepancy in narratives here. Now, all of this depends on a number of things. Indeed, that past action has a large impact on subsequent action, that we can overcome the lock-in problem through innovation and scaling, what are the dynamics between front runners and followers, and that indeed at the international level, we have spaces, otherwise known as institutions, that are themselves catalytic, that somehow provide, enhance, magnifies the dynamic of these alternative understandings of cooperation. Now, if we take all of this in, I've developed a kind of 2x2 matrix to give us a sense, and I want you to kill it, destroy it, deconstruct it. This is not, I'm working on this, so I'd love to have the feedback on this. And that's my last slide, is this 2x2 matrix. So there are two kind of distinctions that are relevant here. One is the mode of action, and of course it's a spectrum, I'm simplifying, from coercive to cooperative, and of course coercive includes financial sanctions and all the rest of it. And then there is regime choice. Okay, sorry, I'm using IR jargon, but is it a EU-centric approach or is it a multilateral approach? And again, it is simplifying. So, what we've been alluding to all the time and what we're going to come back to is what I call the incentive logic, but it is basically a coercive logic that is unilateral, unidirectional. And then it's the EU starting from itself and creating unilateral action. And of course, this is the week when we really talk about CBAM, although with Jan, we were talking earlier about the fact that CBAM, it's an illusion that is starting now. We're just starting to monitor. It's not really doing right now. But of course, so we can, partly our story is going to deconstruct this incentive logic. I mean, incentive logic is CBAM, yes, but also corporate sustainability due diligence directive, the regulation on deforestation-free products, all of these really nice measures that really leverage on the size of our single market. And cost to entry and value of entry in the single market. And of course, there are lots of problems with that. First of all, it is a shrinking market as a percentage of world trade. So there is a kind of a there's a word I can't find.
Can be below the critical mass.
Yeah, and complacency is the word I was. So the problem is not only normative, that the rest of the world says, who are you to impose your way of measuring what we do to us in terms of tariff or supply chain obligation for corporations? Why do you know better? There's kind of a sort of normative argument. And then there's a pure complacency, efficiency argument. It's different. We need to distinguish them, which is simply that really it's going to work, size of the market. And of course, CBAM, I'm part of the skeptical crowd, but who am I to say? But, we heard earlier from the earlier presentations, all the price and sectoral coverage of already, even if you have ETS in another country is very hard. If you don't have ETS, what are the proxies for ETS? How do we measure and all of this? And above all, to me, the gap between the technical assessments they're going to make by the hyper-competent commission represented here, and the diplomatic wrangling that are going to be, what, really? You think what we're doing is not efficient? Well, how are you objectively measuring equivalence? So the measure of equivalence is in the eyes of the beholder, et cetera, et cetera. So the problem is definitely that you add an EU-centric approach to a coercive approach that hurts, or will it hurt? So this is where we can have a conversation about this. But of course, what are the alternatives here? And what I'm interested in is the conversation. And this is not a story about how, and I know I have 2 minutes left, but let me just go very quickly to the other 3 boxes. It's not necessarily a story about alternative approaches, of course. They complement each other, but there are trade-offs. I mean, they're not entirely complementary. And there is a question of narrative about Europe's role in the world and what's more efficient. So how and to what extent do we want to move to other logics, and are we moving to other logics? Now, that's the 3 other logics. So on one hand, you stay on the coercive front, but you go multilateral. So it's an expansive logic. It's the clubs beyond the EU logic. We've heard about G7, there are other alliances, co-production of public goods but in a multilateral context. But still, these clubs do things to others that they don't want it done to them. And then there is the moving downwards. Okay, you stay EU-centric, but you're more cooperative. And some people would say CBAM is that. CBAM is not coercive. It's just an inducement to cooperation. So they will change and we'll help them change. Maybe we'll give them money to change. But nevertheless, the bigger demonstration logic has to do more with contagion, emulation, others imitating what we do and us helping them imitate us. So, we move from ETS to Fit for 55. Maybe we're demonstrating how regional public goods can become global public goods. How do we do it? After all, we have rich and poor countries. We have North and South. We have West and East. We have compensation mechanisms, compensation schemes. We talked a lot about the social climate funds with all of its problems. We're back to failures, learning from failure or difficulties, loss and damage, all of the discussion globally about compensation. Can they learn from how we do it or how we fail to do it? Because it's so hard. But there are other really kind of sexy stuff like how we do city networks and many other examples we can think of. But finally, the fourth logic, which is after all the ultimate multilateral logic, is the discretionary logic. I mean, ultimately the COP logic, the Paris Agreement logic, and the idea that somehow change will come in a catalytic way, and this is where this catalytic model really comes into its own, by simply having first mover advantage, creating alliances, coming up with co-design and co-benefits, etc., and how the EU can help in that, in creating ad hoc alliances, monitoring, sorry, there's typos, mutual empowerment, incentive schemes, etc. And what is our role into this huge ocean of 199 countries where we are one? We are even discretionary in and of itself. We were talking with Jan about whether it's EU, individual states versus the EU itself, who speaks at COP. So we demonstrate by our own failure to have one voice, but maybe that's okay, because the rest of the world can see that we're not a monolith. I think that's okay, if you ask me, but many disagree with me. But that's the discretionary logic. So, and to conclude, in this discussion, in this whole conversation about EU as a laboratory, I want to, how do we move between these logic and combine them? But I want to emphasize the fact that I believe there are other laboratories around the world. So very recently, I'm sure some of you have looked at this. There are a number of Pacific countries that have, stressed out that COP27 don't even mention oil and gas. Fossil fuel is outside the COP discourse and narrative and words. And so they've created the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and with all of these countries having signed very few, but they're creating their own laboratory in the Pacific for a global approach. And you may be very skeptical about it, but we are not the only laboratory in the world.